Hi, welcome. This is the first video in a video series that I'm making on the appearance of Jesus Christ from ancient iconography, okay? So this is going to be a multi-video series because there's a lot of pieces to this discussion. It's a lot more complex than I expected, but there's a lot of good information in here, a lot of new information that you're not going to find anywhere else. So stick around and subscribe, and we'll go through it, all the details together. This first video is going to be focusing on the question of whether or not images were even made of Jesus from eyewitnesses of him. A lot of people deny that. They think that early Christians were aniconic, so they couldn't have made images, okay? So we'll be talking about that claim and some other outdated claims. I'll be talking about archaeological witnesses, images in Roman culture, okay, and then written witnesses, and archaeological support for an ancient iconographic tradition in the early church. So again, this is information, a lot of this that you're not going to find in other places. So let's get into it. Many people deny that images of Jesus were produced by eyewitnesses of Christ. Okay, so the typical narrative goes something like early Christians did not produce images of Jesus because they were aniconic, okay, or iconophobic, or iconoclastic, okay, they were against images. And the Christians were following the Jews, who they came out of, who also supposedly were aniconic, okay? And being against images, they used only symbols of Jesus, things like a cross or Christogram or something. And only after centuries did they finally start making images of Jesus. And being centuries removed from Christ, the earliest images of Jesus were made from artists' imagination, completely made up, fabricated, using elements from pagan gods and cultural norms at the time. So, therefore, our archaeological record of iconography in the church is not reliable. It's based off of total fabrication, made up pagan motifs and things like that, okay? Nancy Grubb, she's an art historian. She writes, the earliest Christians, many of whom came out of the Judaic tradition, with its explicit prohibition against making or worshiping idols, use only the simplest of visual symbols. Early depictions of Christ embodied in human form were generally based on types adopted from the pagan world. So there you have it. There's all the pieces of this traditional, and I say traditional, within the past few centuries view. So there's some problems with this view, okay, especially if you're a Christian. If our images of our faith don't correspond to reality, then that gives the impression that our faith is not founded on reality. Okay, so if Christians are comfortable making up fake images of Jesus, then they're probably comfortable making up fake stories too. Okay, so we made up images of Jesus. What's to say we didn't make up stories of Jesus as well? Okay. And of course, logically, it doesn't follow, but it gives that impression, and it gives this experience of Christianity that there are lies, lies in our images and perhaps lies in our narratives as well. So, I'm calling into question how healthy it is from a religious standpoint to have lies in images in our churches and in our homes intermingling with our faith, because we want our faith to be grounded on things that are true. Okay, so if you're a Christian and you hold to this narrative that images of Jesus are totally fabricated, totally made up, pagan based images, then, that might be problematic for you if you're somebody who values truth. So if we have a fake image of Jesus, we're also not much better than the pagans who made fake images of their gods. Okay, so the Bible actually condemns fake images. Because that's exactly what idols are. They're fake images. Jeremiah 10:14 says, every metalsmith is put to shame by an image, for his molded image is a falsehood. Okay, so it's not a good thing to have a fake image of a god in your house, right? That's just not a good, it's not a good thing. You're maybe a step away from idolatry at that point. But this view, from a scholarly perspective, I think it blocks our ability to do objective research because it establishes a bias against the integrity of historic iconographers. So if you're looking at the data with a certain preconceived notion that you're looking at something fake, then it could warp your ability to interpret the data objectively. Okay, so if you're approaching early Christian archaeological discoveries, and you already have a preconceived notion that, okay, when I'm looking at something totally fake, then it could really affect your ability to interpret that data from an objective point of view. And then, of course, it contradicts church tradition and conciliar authority. If you're a Catholic, if you're an Orthodox Christian, we have church statements on images. Okay, we have church fathers who talk about images. We have images in our churches. We have traditions based around images. And to just come up, suddenly and say, oh, actually, these are fake, that's not really Jesus. You're kind of stepping on toes of 2,000 years of tradition in the church. So I don't want us to take it too lightly. I think if you've gone to a university or something and the topic comes up, they'll probably tell you that, oh, we don't really know what Jesus looked like. These images are just made up, whatever. I don't think we should take that too lightly and just roll over. It's probably worth pushing back a little bit, to defend some of these traditions in our church for the reasons I've just outlined. Okay, so let's get into some of the outdated claims. Okay, archaeology has debunked this narrative. Okay, that's really important. Archaeology has changed the game when it comes to images in the church. It's absolutely revolutionized the traditional narrative by producing many sites in early Jewish and Christian, with early Jewish and Christian images. Okay, so archaeology therefore offers a new perspective of the early church, which complements our written resources and offers a more accurate understanding of early Christian attitudes towards images. So you might already be familiar with this if you've spent any time in apologetic circles on images, maybe by Catholics or by Orthodox, who are talking about images in ancient Judaism and Christianity. Archaeology in the past 100 years, and really in the past, I would say 50 years, has changed how scholars understand images in the place of ancient Judaism, ancient Christianity. The ancient writings, they either don't talk a lot about it. Okay, so if you read ancient Jewish writings, ancient Christian writings, they don't talk a whole lot about images. If they do, it kind of sounds negative. So you get the impression from the writing that images either weren't important or were something bad. But then you look at the archaeology and you see images all over the place in both Judaism and Christianity between the 3rd and 6th centuries. And you're thinking, how do I fit these two things together? Well, they're not contradictory, obviously, because they're both witnesses to the ancient church, but they're complementary. They give you two different perspectives on images in the early church, okay? So many scholars are catching up to new discoveries in archaeology and are forced to rewrite the narrative. Dr. Jeffrey Spear writes, the theory that Jews were opposed to pictures on theological grounds was shattered by a series of discoveries in the early 20th century that revealed an extensive tradition of decorated Jewish synagogues. Okay, Mary Charles Murray writes, it was until fairly recently a universally held theory that the absence of art was due to the hostility of the early church towards religious imagery. A comprehensive theory was constructed, making of Christianity a normatively iconophobic religion because of its roots in Judaism. The introduction of art was seen as a part of a progressive paganization of the church. This account remained the framework of all thinking until the 1970s, when it was subjected to revision. Okay, so you see what the scholars are saying, that archaeology in the past 100 years has forced scholars to revise the narrative. It shattered that old narrative, that the Jews are aniconic, so the Christians are aniconic, so they had no images of Jesus. That whole narrative just crumbles, okay? And it cleans wipes the whiteboard clean. And we need to go back to the drawing board and reconstruct a new understanding of images in the place of the early church, okay? This is a picture of the synagogue in Dura Oropos. This is one of those archaeological sites that these scholars were talking about. This thing dates to as early as the late 2nd century, and as late the latest possible date to the early 3rd century. Okay, and you can see it's just absolutely decked in images, right? They didn't find one little picture in there. The whole wall is covered with pictures of people, and these are scenes from the Bible. So how can Jews be aniconic if their synagogues look like that, right? You see how it seems to completely, change the narrative. So recent archaeological discoveries also include early Christian sites. At the same city, Dura Europos, there was a Christian church discovered with a baptistry containing images. It forces scholars to reinterpret the narrative of early Christian attitudes towards art. So Dr. Robin Jensen writes, okay, and this is after, in her book, after she explores the archaeology, explores the written narratives on images, she comes to this conclusion. She says, it seems reasonable to conclude that if Christians began to make and use significant and characteristic visual art of their own around the beginning of the 3rd century, it was not because most 1st and 2nd century Christians were generally iconophobic. Okay, did you catch that? Not generally iconophobic. In other words, if images were not there in the 1st and 2nd centuries, which she's not granting, but she's, entertaining the thought, you can't say it was because all Christians were iconophobic, right? The archaeology is pointing against that old narrative that they're all iconoclasts or iconophobes. So she continues to explore the possibility in her book. This is from her book, Face to Face, Portraits of the Divine in Early Christianity. She continues to explore the possibility that the lack of examples of early Christian images in the 1st and 2nd century is not due to such images never existing, but due to destruction over time. And to me, this seems obvious, but since we have, multiple centuries of scholarship having this view that early Christians made no images for hundreds of years, it's actually taking, some time for that to overturn. But she's saying that the reason why there's no images that we have today in our hands that come down to us from the 1st and 2nd centuries is due to destruction, not because the early Christians were aniconic. She says the very fact that we may study Christian art from the turn of the 3rd century is likely due to the fortuitous survival of certain sites, in particular those that were underground, catacombs, and safe from future urban renewal or deliberate destruction during earlier eras of persecution or later periods of iconoclasm, especially in the eastern part of the empire. She says another theory that almost all older, that's older than the 3rd century, artifacts were lost or destroyed owing either to the vicissitudes of persecution, the destruction of Christian objects and buildings, or the consequence of urban renewal, when older and less opulent churches were torn down to make way for new building in the 4th century, is supported by archaeological finds, okay? So when she's talking about archaeological finds, she's talking about places like Dura Europos. And I have a picture here on the slide of how Dura Europos looked before and after it was buried. So the Persians were planning on invading the city of Dura Europos. This is back in the 3rd century. And so the citizens of Dura Europos decided to bury their western wall with dirt and rubble to make a barrier from the invading Persians. Well, in that wall was an early Christian church. So they buried this church, okay, in all of this dirt and rubble. Well, that dirt and rubble ended up preserving that church all the way up to the present time when it was rediscovered in the 20th century. Okay, so the fact that it was buried, it preserved the paintings that were in it. And she's pointing out the fact that, well, if that survived because it was buried, then it begs the question, what didn't survive because it wasn't buried, right? So she's just looking at the implication of the archaeology that everything we have today has the common pattern of it survived because it was buried. It was a catacomb or a buried wall or something like that. So she's saying that it really makes you think that there were other images at the same time and even earlier that just didn't survive. They weren't lucky enough to be buried like Dura Europos or the catacombs in Rome. Okay? So the implication, therefore, is that images of biblical scenes, including images of Christ, existed in other Christian sites in the 3rd century and likely the 1st and 2nd centuries. So in this baptistry, and I have a picture of a recreation of it. This is in the Yale University Gallery. In this baptistry, there are scenes from the Bible, okay, pictures of biblical scenes. So the implication is that other churches and other Christian sites looked like this not just geographically in other places at that time, but also earlier in the 2nd and 1st century. They just weren't lucky enough to survive. So she writes, based on the example from Dura, it seems likely that other early Christian buildings were similarly adorned. We do know that Christian buildings were demolished during the Great Persecution of the early 4th century, and their walls may well have been enhanced with paintings. So in order for images to survive over ground, okay, that weren't buried, they would have to survive waves of persecution. They'd have to survive new buildings being built, from being demolished, from builders. They'd have to survive iconoclasm. It'd have to survive Islam, all kinds of things. It'd have to survive 2,000 years. It's a long time to survive above ground. So these are some pictures from Dura Europos. You can see how colorful and how rich with imagery this baptistry was. We have a scene of Jesus pulling Peter out of the water. Okay, Jesus is walking on water. You can see the boat with the disciples behind them. This is a good shepherd, a symbol of Christ. We have Adam and Eve by the tree. We have a procession of women, which could be a reference to the virgins, who are prepared with their lamps, had their lamps lit. We have a scene of Christ healing the paralytic. So the idea that they're aniconic is just not true. That first premise of the old narrative is just gone. But without that blocker, okay, so now you can't say that Christians couldn't make images because they're iconoclasts or whatever. You can't say that anymore. So they're no longer blocked from making images. Well, that being said, they're actually likely to have made images because of their Roman culture, okay? It's no longer far-fetched that early Christians made images of Christ because they were not aniconic, according to the archaeology. We know that Greco-Roman society was full of art in temples, public buildings, baths, eating places, houses. Everything was covered in colors and pictures and in all kinds of art. They painted scenes of loved ones, heroes, deities, portraits, scenes, and all kinds of other decorations, plants and animals, all kinds of things everywhere. So the fact that this was the world in which Christianity came into the world, okay, it came through the Roman Empire, then it's likely that that Roman Empire led the Christians to making images of Christ, especially if they weren't blocked by aniconism. Thousands of people were impacted by Jesus and taught by his disciples. Early Christians of Roman origin, therefore, would feel inclined to make images of Jesus. Okay, so these are Roman citizens, people in Roman culture who are used to having images around in their homes and in their temples. And once they encountered Christ, they would feel inclined by virtue of their culture to make images of him. Okay, so if they're not blocked from making images, they would feel that gravity towards making images of him. Not being inclined against images, the first Christians would not have been inhibited from applying their typical Roman custom of applying images to their faith, okay? Uspensky writes, he says, church tradition traces the first icons back to the lifetime of the Savior himself and the period immediately after him, as is well known. The art of portraiture was at that time flourishing in the Roman Empire. Portraits were made of relatives and distinguished people. Therefore, there are no grounds for supposing that Christians, especially those of pagan origin, were an exception to the general rule. That's the general rule of using Roman art. Okay, so he's saying the first Christians coming out of the Roman Empire, out of this culture that had portraiture that was thriving, they would have not been an exception to the general rule of Roman society of making portraits of distinguished people. And for them, Jesus Christ would have been a very distinguished person. Okay, so we have a picture here of a house in Pompeii. This is someone's house. Notice how colorful it is. Paintings. This is a taberna from Pompeii. It's a reconstruction, but you can see all the beautiful art on the counter. This is a Roman house wall in Ephesus. This dates to the 1st century. This is the same century, the same time period that Paul was writing to the church in Ephesus. This is actually a wall from the very city where the church of Ephesus was. This was their world. This is what it looked like. It was colorful and full of images. And here's some portraits from Pompeii. And these are not, gods or something, emperors or something like that. These are portraits of people that people made and had in their homes. And you can see, just like Uspensky said, portraiture was thriving at that time. So this is normal Roman culture, okay, for the early Christians. Well, as it turns out, this is exactly what the 4th century church historian Eusebius reports. He says, they say that this statue is an image of Jesus. It has remained to our day, so that we ourselves also saw it when we were staying in the city. Nor is it strange that those of the Gentiles, that's the Greeks and the Romans, who of old were benefited by our Savior, should have done such things, since we have learned also that the likenesses of his apostles Paul and Peter, and of Christ himself, are preserved in paintings. The ancients being accustomed, as it is likely, according to the habit of the Gentiles, to pay this kind of honor indiscriminately to those regarded by them as deliverers. Okay? An extremely important quote. This is a reliable source. This is Eusebius, the ancient early Christian historian who wrote the history of the early church after the book of Acts. Okay, so he gives us a window into what was going on at that time, and he tells us that Roman converts to Christianity, okay, Romans who interact with Christ, by virtue of their culture, made images of Jesus which survived up to his time. Okay, so this is written proof that images of Jesus were produced. Now, Eusebius doesn't tell exactly who the Gentiles were who made the first images or how those Gentiles related to the apostles. But the church fathers later point out the obvious implication that whoever they were among the first generation of the church and therefore under the oversight of the apostles. Bishop Leo of Rhodes, this is during the Seventh Ecumenical Council, he stated, "Truth and piety require there being holy and sacred images in Holy Church according to a custom passed down from ancient times from the holy apostles." Okay? The church's images, which at least included images of Paul, Peter, and Jesus, was therefore a part of apostolic tradition and falls under those oral traditions mentioned by Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2:15. Okay, so if you remember, Paul is writing to the Thessalonians, he says, "Stand fast and hold to the traditions which you were taught, whether by word or our epistle." Okay, so Paul didn't just throw a letter off the donkey and right away. Okay, that's not what happened. He stayed in these places with these churches and he taught them orally how to be Christians, how to practice like Christians and live like Christians. Okay, so we know that images of Christ were around at that time. That's what Eusebius reports. So part of the life of the church at that time included the circulation of images of Christ. So Eusebius's quote by inference implies that part of that tradition that was being talked about included images of Christ, even if it wasn't specifically specified in the scriptures. There's a sort of general reference to those things outside the scriptures that were being done and seen by the apostles. So the archaeological record supports these claims of Eusebius, Paul, and Bishop Leo by revealing the presence of a widespread image tradition in the early churches. Okay, this is really important, and this is one of those things you're not going to find it in other places. It's really new scholarship behind this stuff. So stick with me on this. Images have been discovered in some of the most ancient Christian sites in the world. You know that. But more significantly, the images follow similar patterns and motifs, indicating participation in a shared tradition. So the selection of stories chosen for depictions is shared, further indicating a shared image set. Okay, so not only are there images in the archaeology, but there are the same images in different sites, okay? Like different artists are copying from the same prototype image, which indicates not just the use of images, but the participation of an iconographic tradition being shared in the churches, okay? And I have an example here of the baptism of Jesus. These are two different images. One is a Syriac painting, okay, from the Rabula Gospels. This is a 6th century painting of Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. And then the other one's from Rome. It's a 3rd century depiction. And they look like two different artists were copying from the same prototype, okay? And then the position of the bodies, the angles, it's obviously the same motif in two different places. And it's not just this, there's a ton of examples like this. Well, the scholarship acknowledges this. There's just no way around it. Dr. Robin Jensen writes, despite certain distinctions in style, the similarity between some of the themes found on the Dura baptistry walls and motifs from the Roman catacombs also suggests some common influence and perhaps even some shared models. Although we have no extant examples, it seems possible that certain influential prototypes, okay, maybe illuminated biblical manuscripts, perhaps provided patterns or cartoons contained in circulating books of artisans' motifs that could account for some level of consistency. And she's not the only one to acknowledge this. We have, similar ideas from Kurtz Weitzman, Herbert Kessler, okay? Things like the Good Shepherd that you see in Dura Oropos, you see it all over in the catacombs. The one you saw earlier, the baptism of Jesus. There's so many of these motifs that you see in places again and again and again and again, okay? And it implies that the Christians are participating in a tradition. They have a traditional set, a traditional repertoire of images that they received from some ancient prototype tradition. Dr. Michael Ivanovich Rostovzev, he writes, it is true that the painters of Dura were not creative artists. They certainly repeated to the best of their ability traditional motifs, okay? So the images at Dura Oropos were not just made up, whatever, but is an example of the ancient iconographic tradition of the church. That's a traditional motifs that they found there. Valeria Kuvatova, in her lecture Early Christian Funerary Painting in Thessaloniki, Macedonian and Roman Traditions, she writes, the iconography of the most popular early Christian compositions had already attained a canonic form by the mid-3rd century. The iconography of most depictions of biblical episodes in Thessalonian tombs corresponds to the mainstream early Christian artistic tradition, okay? Notice that by the mid-3rd century, okay? Not starting in the 3rd century, but because archaeology only takes us back to the 3rd century. Like Robin Jensen was talking about, anything before that was likely just destroyed. Okay, but we can see as far back as the mid-3rd century, and we can see at that point there was already a canonical iconographic tradition in the churches, shared in the churches. Okay, well, this repertoire, this tradition, traditional motifs, whatever you want to call it, canonical tradition, whatever, included images of Jesus. Okay, you've seen some already. You've seen the baptism of Jesus. Well, here's an example of one of those motifs. You can see Dura Oropos has Jesus healing the paralytic. You have an example in Rome. This is Roman gold glass of the 4th century. Milan, in Ravenna and Mosaic. 4 different places, but the scene looks similar, the same in each one. It's like if you gave 4 different students, the same picture, and you said, copy this picture, and each student copied the picture, and that you can see each one has its, distinctive qualities because of that artist, but they're aiming for that, a copy of some prototype. And this is what the scholars are noticing. There's many examples of these all around the church, and they're just acknowledging the obvious fact. Okay, there was a canonical tradition of iconography in the church by the 3rd century. Okay, so we have the Nativity of Christ, the Adoration of the Magi, baptism of Jesus, Jesus turns water into wine, and so on. There's all these stories that are within this canonical tradition of images being used and shared in the churches. So in other words, the tradition was not simply being artistic, but the tradition was the images themselves passed around as a prototype repertoire of images. Now, where did this tradition come from? That's the question that I think gets us, it moves us closer to answering the question of whether or not images of Jesus were made. Well, the answer is scholars don't know. They don't know who produced the prototype set of images, but whoever produced it must predate the mid-3rd century. And they also must have had widespread influence in the churches around the empire. Again, this is not, me making this up. The scholarship is acknowledging this based off of the archaeology. There's no hiding from it. There's no running from it. We know that somebody with widespread influence in the churches before the mid-3rd century had a prototype set of images that were passed around the churches. Okay, and there's a reference to the Good Shepherd painting in Tertullian, okay, in the early 3rd century, around between 213 and 217, which might even push that repertoire back even further into the 2nd century, okay? So maybe, Tertullian referencing the Good Shepherd. By the way, he references it as customary. He takes it sort of granted that that's there. Kind of implies that repertoire even goes back further, okay? So perhaps the repertoire of images revealed by the archaeology is a footprint of that unwritten custom passed down from ancient times from the holy apostles. Maybe the apostles themselves produced a set of images as part of their ministry of teaching the gospel, especially for those who couldn't read, okay? It is certainly what we would expect to see, and I'm talking about the archaeology, if iconography was a part of apostolic tradition. So if Paul and Peter or whoever was using a set of images to spread the gospel, you would expect to see all around the empire a shared image tradition, just like what you see in the archaeology. In that case, images of Jesus in the early Christian traditional repertoire would descend from eyewitnesses, or at least be approved of by eyewitnesses of Jesus, namely the apostles. Okay, so either the apostles produced them or someone else did. They're using them in their ministry. They're seeing these images of Jesus and they're approving these images of Jesus in the church. Okay, again, I'm not expecting this to be, hard proof evidence that the apostles had images, but the archaeology is pointing in that direction by revealing this ancient iconographic tradition. And whoever produced it would have to be someone very early before the 3rd century, possibly into the 2nd century, and they'd have to have widespread influence. Why did all the churches why did the church at Dura Europos receive these images and think it was important to preserve these images on the wall unless these images were coming from somebody with influence, somebody important? Okay, and you can see some of these images on this sarcophagus. This is one of many examples. There's a ton of these examples if you study early Christian iconography, but just to show you what I'm talking about, on this sarcophagus, we have multiple scenes from the life of Christ, okay? We have the nativity, we have Jesus turning water into wine, Jesus multiplies loaves and fishes, Jesus heals the blind man, the resurrection of Lazarus. Now, remember, the tradition is not that these images are there, but the point is that how these scenes are drawn, the motif of how they're drawn, corresponds to how they're drawn in other places, okay? So particularly, for example, Lazarus, the way his tomb looks with these 2 pillars and this pointed roof, and the way that he's wrapped up and where he's standing and how Jesus is standing, it's all like it was copied in all these places, okay? We have an example here. This is a reliquary from Zadar, Croatia, totally different place, but here are some of those same scenes. Jesus multiplies the loaves and fishes. Jesus heals the blind man, the resurrection of Jesus, okay? And you can see, if you look closely, you can see that little tomb that Lazarus is standing in. It's trying to be the same shape as this one, right? It's trying to be this little house. He's wrapped up in the same way. Jesus is standing in the similar position, okay? So this is just 2 examples, but there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of Christians using the same motifs in their art. Here's another one. You can see, again, actually, this is the raising of Lazarus. You can see very clearly, a sarcophagus from Spain, a reliquary from Croatia, a glass cup from Germany, and then a painting from Rome. And it's like, again, 4 different artists are producing copies of a prototype image. So this is a part of that ancient Christian iconographic tradition, and I'm saying that this is what you'd expect to see if images go back to the time of the apostles. You'd expect to see the churches sharing this tradition. Okay, so scholars don't know who created the prototypes for the tradition or how it got passed around to the churches. But one possibility is the prototypes were part of the apostolic ministry to evangelize the illiterate. This theory finds some support in the ancient story of Luke having painted an image of Mary. You might have heard this before. Okay, it's a very popular story. This legend is reported by the 6th century church historian Theodore Lector. He wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History. Unfortunately, it's been lost. But it was quoted by a historian named Nikiforos Kalislis Canthopoulos, okay, in the 14th century, and he says, Theodore says that Eudocia sent to Pulcheria from Jerusalem an image of the Mother of God painted by the Apostle Luke, okay? So this is an interesting account, okay? This is from a church historian, so there it has some weight by who he is, Theodore Lector, an historian. It also has some weight because Eudocia is an empress, okay, and she was living in Jerusalem, so she has the caliber of someone who maybe has a good judgment on these things, and her story is repeated by an historian, so it has some weight to it. And the fact that it's about Luke is also appropriate. Luke has a Gentile background, he has apostolic approval, he has influence in the church, and all of these things fit the bill of what the archaeological narrative is, that somebody with a Gentile background, with apostolic approval, is most likely to be the one to pass around these images. He also has an evangelistic spirit, as you can see in his gospel and in Acts, okay? So it's unlikely that the image in reference to the story was actually a hand-painted icon by Luke, okay? But the legend could be an echo of an ancient history of how the iconographic tradition came into the church. Uspensky writes, those icons which are said to be St. Luke's form a tradition for which he may have provided the prototypes. So maybe this is an echo of a lost story of how Luke created a repertoire of images for the church, okay? It's some, I would say, soft evidence for putting the pieces together, figuring out where did that repertoire in the early Christian church come from. Now, what's striking is that archaeology does show within the early Christian repertoire an icon of Mary like that which Luke supposedly painted. So if you look at this repertoire, one of those images that keeps coming up is the adoration of the Magi. And this adoration of the Magi image has within it Mary holding a young Jesus in her lap. And this is very close to the image that this tradition says that Luke painted. So did Luke provide the repertoire? And one of those images was the adoration of the Magi, which was copied, and eventually the tradition was established that Luke painted it. Maybe, right? Maybe. I'm not saying that this is, absolute hard proof, but I'm just saying that there are connections here between the repertoire, between Luke, between the tradition, between the archaeology. There are some maybe coincidences that aren't so coincidental. Maybe there are echoes of truth in these ancient traditions that are connections. But perhaps the most thorough tradition accounting for the origin of the iconic tradition is found in the 8th century work, The Life of Saint Pancratius, okay, written by Evagrius. This work records a Sicilian oral tradition about 2 volumes of picture stories of the Old and New Testaments being produced, painted by a man named Joseph, under the commission of Peter, the apostle, and passed to new churches as prototypes for church art. So it's a very specific story about who created the images, who they were created under, and how they were passed to the churches as prototype art. It says, the blessed apostle Peter sent for the painter Joseph and said to him, make me the image of our Lord Jesus Christ, so that on seeing the form of his face, the people may believe all the more and be reminded of what I have preached to them. So the painter took waxen colors and painted the image of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is what the apostles did in all the cities and villages from Jerusalem as far as Antioch. And having taken thought, Peter made the entire picture story of the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, beginning with the angel's cry, "Hail to the Virgin," and ending with the ascension of our Lord Jesus Christ. And he commanded that the churches should be decorated with this story. Okay, so I have a painting here that is dated as early as the 2nd century that's interpreted commonly as the Annunciation. So is this possibly one of those pictures that's a copy from Peter's picture story? Maybe. Could be. Okay. This work has patristic support, which is interesting. It's quoted as authentic by church fathers such as Saint Theodore the Studite and Saint Nicephorus. Okay, Saint Theodore quotes from the life of Saint Pancratius. He says, "The voice of Peter, Prince of the Apostles, take the image of our Lord Jesus Christ and take it to the tower, so that the peoples may see what form the Son of God chose to assume." This is a quote directly from this work, okay? This work was also generally held as authentic by the Orthodox side during the iconoclast controversy. It specifies the use of encaustic paints, which is interesting. So if you know about the history of painting mediums, by the time of Evagrius's lifetime, encaustic paints would have been replaced by tempera paints, okay, egg tempera paint. So the fact that he specifies that Peter's images were used encaustic paints is just interesting. It's an interesting little detail that maybe a forger wouldn't necessarily think of. It lists motifs, the majority of which correspond to those early Christian motifs that we see in the repertoire. The setting of the story is in Pontus, and we know that Peter evangelized in Pontus. You can see 1 Peter 1 verse 1, he mentions it. And a Petrine origin of early Christian iconography would explain the abundant iconography in the Roman catacombs and surrounding areas. So when you're talking about early Christian archaeology of iconography, Rome is the #1 place that you're going to find it, just in volume. There's so many pictures there in the catacombs and churches and basilicas and things. And if that was, if the images were really wherever Peter was, he was bringing these pictures with him, it would explain why there's so many images in Rome. Most interestingly, though, it corresponds to the archaeological record by referencing picture books as sources of prototype images. Okay, so if you remember, Robin Jensen gave the theory that maybe early Christians were using picture books. Okay, so the scholarship now is theorizing picture books, and this story is providing a story about picture books. So it corresponds very nicely with what we see in the archaeology. Okay, so perhaps, these are not true stories. Okay, maybe they've been corrupted or whatever, they've been interpolated. Okay, but maybe they're echoes of an unwritten story of how images were used by the apostles to spread the gospel. Okay, so maybe there is some truth to these stories. Maybe Peter, maybe Luke, maybe they used images as part of their ministry. And these legends from oral traditions are sort of ripples or echoes of that history. If nothing else, these stories provide a traditional alternative explanation for early Christian art, which 100 years ago might have been laughable. But today, thanks to modern archaeology, these stories seem more likely than ever before. So in conclusion, archaeology and modern scholarship shatter the outdated idea that ancient Jews and early Christians were all aniconic. Archaeology implies that there were probably images in 1st and 2nd century Christian sites. They just didn't survive, okay? Early Christians would have been culturally inclined to make images of Jesus by virtue of the Roman culture. And written resources like Eusebius confirm that the likeness of Jesus had been produced and preserved up to his time. Okay, that pretty much ends the debate right there. That's a very reliable source that tells us those images were produced. And it's exactly what we would expect. It's not crazy. It's not weird, right? Thanks to archaeology. But archaeology also reveals that early Christians participated in an ancient iconographic tradition. We don't know where it comes from. But perhaps it originates in the apostles themselves, as echoed in oral traditions from Sicily and Jerusalem. Okay, so I think it's very reasonable to say that images of Jesus were produced. There's plenty of evidence for that, and I think that it's much less likely that they weren't produced, okay, for these reasons. Next, I'm going to be talking about the reliability of the iconographic record, and then get into the details of what that shows about Jesus's appearance, okay? So this is the first part. I highly recommend subscribing so you can get access to those second parts, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for watching.